Welcome back to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. We're pleased to welcome CEI fellow Ryan Young, co-author of People Not Ratios, Why the Debate Over Income Inequality Asks the Wrong Questions. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Bill.
Ryan, you and your colleague Ian Murray at CEI recently published a pair of reports analyzing income inequality, arguing that it's more important to pursue policies that improve the lives of the poor instead of obsessing about the nominal dollar gap between the poor and the rich. Is that a fair characterization?
It is. Everybody wants to help the poor and make the poor better off. That's not what's at issue here. We're trying to change the way people talk about poverty and how to make people better off. So the title of our paper is People, Not Ratios. Instead of talking about the ratios between rich and poor, we want people to focus on the poor themselves, the people, how to help them.
How do you define absolute poverty versus relative poverty? I know your paper deals with that.
Yeah, that's a very important concept. Absolute poverty just means you're very, very poor by an objective standard.
You don't have clean water. You're cooking over a dung fire.
Yeah, sanitation, electricity. The official benchmark for that is an income of $1.90 per day. Imagine living on that and having a Western style of living. That's difficult. And that is what we're trying to get people to focus on, helping people in absolute poverty.
If you look at the global statistics on absolute poverty, it seems to be disappearing at the fastest rate pretty much in all of human history, and largely because more people and more nations are participating in market economies. Why is this good news given so little attention by income inequality activists?
A bit more about that, actually. World population has roughly tripled over the last century or so. Over that same period of time, the number of people living in absolute poverty has dropped by more than half. So more people and fewer of them in absolute poverty. An economist I admire calls this perhaps the most important development in all of human history since the invention of fire or the invention of agriculture. This is a huge poverty improvement program. China alone has lifted 680 million people out of poverty. That's the greatest poverty reduction program in history, and that's both a reason to celebrate and a reason to double down, I would argue.
So I think you've given us a peek at absolute poverty. What's relative poverty?
Relative poverty is the difference between rich and poor. So if absolute poverty is people, relative poverty is about ratios. How much more does a CEO earn than her employees? How much of the national income does the 1% have compared to the bottom 1%? Those are relative poverty questions, and they will never go away, unlike absolute poverty.
And is relative poverty measured in lifestyle or in dollars?
You can do either. Economists prefer dollars just because you can put a number to it, but lifestyle matters too.
I mean, Bill Gates is much richer than me, but he can't eat too many more steaks than I do.
No, and he has probably medical care that's not that much better than yours, or legal representation that's that much better than yours. He has a fancier car and a bigger house.
So what happens to the relative poverty statistics when you sort of normalize for consumption and look at how people actually live?
What you find is that the rich tend to sock their money away. And I would argue that this is actually a way to level relative poverty, because when a rich man puts his money in a bank or in an investment account, they don't sit on it. Banks will lend that money out to homeowners. They'll lend it out to people with a small business who want to buy new equipment or hire new employees. So in a way, that's investment is a powerful way for the rich to help the poor and reduce relative poverty, especially at the level of consumption.
Except now you have rich directing capital investment rather than having government direct capital investment. Who tends to do better with those investments?
The private sector tends to do better, and it's not close. The reason is that the private sector actually is subject to a price system and profit and loss. If you make a dumb investment decision, you take a loss. If the government takes a loss, well, it's no skin off their nose because they can just get more from the taxpayers.
So there tends to be more of a Darwinian weaning of investors when they're investing with their own money rather than with someone else's money.
I'd say they're just being more careful rather than Darwinian, but yeah.
So even if you go back then and you look at relative poverty statistics, not just in the U.S. and in Western countries, but globally, the difference between the richest and the poorest, how many people are rich and poor, how's the world doing?
Inequality does seem to be on the rise in recent years. Before World War I, things were very unequal, and then you had a Great Depression and 2 world wars, and that lopped off a number of large fortunes, and it reduced inequality quite a bit that way. But since then, in the post-war era, as the world has become more and more prosperous, we've seen a return of inequality to roughly those pre-war levels, at least according to Thomas Piketty, the French economist.
And is he measuring it just in the developed countries, or is he including statistics from all over the world?
Just the developed countries.
So what happens if you include all over the world?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, because I wonder if the lens would look different if you lumped everybody in together.
It might. I mean, if you go to a country like Venezuela or Zimbabwe or North Korea, it's very equal because everyone is poor.
That's one way to solve the problem. You know, one of the things that's always puzzled me about the income inequality debate is actually how the statistics are assembled. You know, I look across my 40-year career, and I've occupied every decile of U.S. income distribution, from the lowest when I was a grad student to the highest when I was a venture capitalist, right back to the middle now that I'm a radio show host. So which version of me is responsible for contributing to income inequality?
They all are. Really, the trouble with that kind of dividing people into deciles and quintiles and centiles, they're snapshots, but people are not snapshots. Their lives are a movie with ups and downs, and your story is a very common one, bouncing around all those different deciles. And I think a lot of inequality activists, they don't take the long-term view.
Well, particularly since if you don't amass some kind of wealth along your life, who's supposed to take care of you in your old age?
That's what Social Security is for, Bill.
So when you look at the income inequality debate, why do wealthy actors and professional athletes usually get a pass from both the public and income inequality activists, while CEOs are their favorite whipping boys?
I can think of 2 reasons off the top of my head. One reason is that a lot of people like sports and movies, so they feel a personal attachment to the athletes and the actors. The second is that when it comes to CEOs, because a lot of the work they do is in boardrooms and behind the scenes and in high-rise skyscrapers, they're not as visible to the public, even though their paychecks may be just as large. And for that reason, a lot of CEOs and business executives have shadowier reputations to the public, even though the work they do is just as honest and just as exceptional.
Prominent progressive politicians often promote the idea that confiscating and redistributing wealth is the best way to reduce inequality. When Venezuela did exactly that, the country plunged into chaos. Given all the historical evidence, why does wealth redistribution remain so popular among politicians and their favorite economists?
The glib answer is that it gets them votes. So that brings us to a deeper answer. It's what the public wants. I think there's a certain sense of aesthetics that it looks bad when a man driving down the street in a Mercedes goes through a neighborhood where everyone else has a Toyota. The people with the Toyotas might see that and maybe be a little resentful. It just looks bad, I guess.
It also encourages people to take out big loans to buy a Mercedes, which brings me to author Thomas Piketty's point. He blames the 2008 global meltdown on income inequality, arguing that the poor and middle classes were induced to take on too much debt, presumably to keep up with the conspicuous consumption of the rich. If you eliminate conspicuous consumption by driving rich people out of the country or confiscating their wealth, wouldn't this make the poor more content, even if their absolute standard of living stagnates?
Piketty used the word induced, which brings up the question, induced by whom? Nobody is forcing anybody to buy a new car they can't afford or a bigger house that maybe they can't make the mortgage on after a year or two. But I would argue that more important than inequality or an innate urge to keep up with the Joneses in causing the financial crisis is, say, Fannie and Freddie, decades of federal policies geared towards increasing home ownership by subsidizing it. Those kinds of things, really, if we're going to use the word induced, did much more to force people to take on debt than any sense of envy or anything like that.
Aside from handing out welfare checks and offering even more free government services, what sustainable economic policies have been shown to improve the absolute standard of living of the poor over the long run?
My co-author Ian Murray and I go into a lot of those in the paper, and I'll spare you most of them. But we have a general ethos of raise, don't level. The title of our policy-oriented paper is The Rising Tide, and that was a deliberate choice. We want to raise the poor. The rich don't need our help, so we can leave them alone. Those policies include things like an honest price system. Half the reason Venezuela and Zimbabwe are such basket cases is with all the inflation they have, they basically don't have a price system. How do you know how much milk is going to cost at the grocery store? It changes from day to day. That makes planning impossible. So if you're going to start up a business and you have to think 10, 20 years ahead, you can't do it. So an honest price system is something every country needs if they want to be able to help their poor. We were mentioning absolute poverty earlier. Affordable energy is very important to raising your standard of living. If you don't have reliable electricity, or if you have to resort to dung fires indoors to heat your home, it's hard to rise out of poverty. So we think that's, especially with the environmental campaigns against any form of fossil fuel, which for now at least, this may change in the future, are still the most affordable and efficient forms of energy, they hurt the poor.
And indoor air pollution tends to be a major killer amongst the world's poor.
Oh, and it reduces quality of life, too. It's a major problem, and affordable energy can go a long way to solving it.
What are some other sustainable policies that will lift up the poor?
Occupational licensing, I think, is a big one, especially for occupations that tend to fall at the lower and middle ends of the spectrum. For example, there is a woman named Benta Diaw. She emigrated from Senegal to the Seattle area here in the U.S. some years ago, and she was very talented at African-style hair braiding. Her mother taught her, and her mother's mother taught her before that, going back probably 100 years or more. So, pretty much as soon as she became an American, she did the most American of all things and started her own hair braiding business. The trouble is that in Washington state, they have very extensive requirements for a cosmetology license. So the government clamped down on her and threatened to close her shop. So she sued because of the kind of natural hair care that Benta Diaw practices. No dyes, no chemicals, no hair products. It's just hair braiding. And in order to get a cosmetology license, she would have to take 1,600 hours of classes plus an exam. And keep in mind, if you work a 40-hour week, you only work about 2,000 hours a year, so she would have to forego 9 months of full-time work and the pay that comes with it to learn things like how to dye hair and other things that her salon does not offer. And they also have no training in hair braiding, so she couldn't even improve her technique there. So I would argue that that kind of occupational license is actually less than useless for Benta Diaw and her customers.
How many jobs in the U.S. today require a license?
About 1/3. So 1 in 3 Americans needs government permission to go to work in the morning.
How does that compare to 100 years ago?
It's gone way, way up. It used to just be doctors, lawyers, elite occupations. As government's grown more and more powerful, there's almost been a return to the old medieval guild mentality. Benta Diaw's story, by the way, has a happy ending. She sued and she won. And to this day, she still has her business. It's actually quite uplifting.
Not everybody can go through that kind of a process to get the right to work, and that's maybe one of the reasons why growth has basically ground to a halt. So, Ryan, the elephant in the room of the income inequality debate is envy. Most economists don't want to study it or even talk about it, yet it's such an essential feature of human nature that it even made it into the Ten Commandments. Why doesn't the role of envy occupy a central place in the income inequality debate?
We don't really go into envy in our papers, so I'm not particularly knowledgeable about that, but you're right that envy is a prominent part of the human condition. It's part of who we are as people. So no doubt there are some people who are motivated by envy, and that's why they might prefer income redistribution as opposed to what we call the rising tide type of policies that lift up the poor. Another motivation that I think a lot of people have is aesthetics. As I mentioned earlier, just even if you're looking, whether it's a guy driving by in a Mercedes or you're looking at a graph of different income quintiles and deciles, a flatter distribution is definitely easier on the eye than a more unequal distribution. But the trouble is, if everybody's poor and everybody's rich, those two very different...
Look the same.
Exactly. So I prefer a higher graph to a lower one, and I think from an ethical and a moral standpoint, the shape of the curve is irrelevant. I just want to see everyone have enough to live with comfort and dignity and security. People, not ratios.
Ryan, thanks for coming on and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, Bill.
That was CEI fellow Ryan Young, co-author of People Not Ratios, Why the Debate Over Income Inequality Asks the Wrong Questions, here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Real Clear Radio Hour is a partnership with Real Clear Politics, which the New York Times has called an invaluable tool for anyone interested in politics or public affairs. You can check out Real Clear Radio Hour on iTunes and follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. Ahead, we'll speak with former presidential candidate and chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, Steve Forbes. Stay tuned.